started. And the first speaker is McCourt, who has been doing the anthropology of birth for 20 years, for over 20 years, and she's gonna, I'm just meeting her myself, so she can tell you all about whatever she wants to tell you about herself, and we'll get started. Thank you.
Okay, I'm not going to tell you anything about myself because we're already running late, and I'd rather tell you about the research. So, I'm going to give you a very, very basic, very brief summary of findings from the Birthplace in England programme. It was a massive programme, including a number of studies, and I'm just going to really give you a few key highlights from different parts of the programme, the different studies within the programme. So first of all, just for those that aren't familiar with the UK care system, we like other countries have had various changes in the system along the history of midwifery, of course, and for a lot of the 20th century, very good community midwifery services and home birth services and maternity homes. That changed in 1970 with the Peel report. There was a flawed analysis of data which included unplanned and unattended home births as well as those that were attended, and the data from that study led to a policy of universal hospital birth from 1970. That was changed when the evidence had been reappraised and critically analysed, so that in the year 2004, we had the National Service Framework, which set out that women should have a choice of place of birth. The evidence at that point was still not really strong enough. It was just that, on balance, the evidence was showing that it was safe for women to choose their birthplace. So the Department of Health commissioned a large research programme in order to provide better quality and more substantial evidence for England. The UK actually has slightly different health systems across Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland and England, so the study focused on England. And that's just a little summary of how care is managed. Now, despite the fact that we had the policy of choice and it was to be delivered by 2009, in fact, the practice has been very slow to catch up with policy. And many professionals who'd been educated and had got used to practicing in an era where the policy was 100% hospital birth were really not very confident. And this was another reason why having a large-scale study was really important. We needed good quality evidence to confirm or not confirm the policy. So this is just a little picture of how things were in 2011 when we were finishing the study and publishing it. And you can see there that we have different types of facilities. The vast majority of women still giving birth in an obstetric unit, and a small number, about 2% in a freestanding midwife unit, 3% in a co-located, what we call an alongside midwife unit. That's somewhere that you can transfer by walking, trolley or wheelchair to an obstetric unit, and about 3% of home births. And there's just a summary of the national intervention rates there to give you an idea of practice at that point. Okay, I'm not going to talk about our mapping study. We did do a mapping study that ran through the course of the overall programme, and it showed basically that women's choice was restricted in practice, if not in policy, by the fact that a lot of these facilities weren't available. So many women actually didn't have physical access to either a freestanding or a hospital-based midwifery unit. And home birth is, you probably are aware, is legally and officially available to all women in Britain, but I'll come on to some of our findings from the case studies around how home birth is currently in the UK. These were the settings that we were comparing, and I hope I've defined them well enough very quickly. The objective of the cohort study, the primary objective, was to compare the the intrapartum and early neonatal mortality and morbidity. And as Betty, those of you who were in the previous session, Betty and Kenneth pointed out that it's very important that this kind of research looks at planned place of birth at the start of care in labour. Otherwise you're not getting accurate figures. And it has to be an intention to treat study as well, because you need to analyse people where they plan to give birth. So those who transfer, you've got to make sure you've included the transfers to make sure you get the higher risk cases accurately in your data set. And we only included for the primary analysis women who were judged to be at low risk of complications, according to our National Institute for Clinical Excellence, NICE guidelines. Those guidelines are available on the internet if you're interested. We did collect data on some higher risk women. The women excluded were planned cesareans for obvious reasons, and we're currently doing further analysis looking at the outcomes for the high risk women. The secondary objective, the secondary outcome, if you like, was to look at maternal outcomes, including rates of intervention. And this was secondary not because we didn't think it was as important, but because of the numbers. To power the study, to look at serious morbidity and mortality, you needed to have a really big study. And the highest quality, as Kenneth has pointed out, the highest quality study is where you've got a prospective study. That's extremely difficult and expensive to do on a large scale. Okay, this just gives you, I'm not expecting you to read this, and I think Kenneth's already given you the kind of headline number anyway. Just to let you know, it was a very large study, just under 80,000 women included overall, of which just under 65,000 were low risk. And of course, we focused on low risk because these are the women who our policy says should be eligible to choose, and they're eligible to give birth in the midwifery unit. The rate of response, the completion of the data forms was extremely high, and the quality of completion was extremely high as well. And that was one reason why this study was very expensive to conduct, because in addition to the research team, we had to have research midwives in every hospital in order to make sure the data forms were completed effectively and accurately. We had a composite outcome of serious maternal morbidity and mortality, focusing on the things that could be affected by care in labour. And the reason for having a composite outcome, it's not ideal, but again, it's about having sufficient power in the study to do significance tests. So these were serious morbidity issues. And you can just see here, actually, it's helpful to know, because newspaper headlines tended to report this outcome as though it was perinatal mortality, which is not accurate. And actually the stillbirth was only 5.6% of the overall, which is of course what you'd expect, because the other serious morbidities are more common. Okay, so the outcomes that I'm just going to give you really a few summary tables. You can access the data. I've given the link on the internet to the detailed reports, and the main study article is in the BMJ, and it's open access as well. So you can see the actual rates of adverse outcomes there, and you can also see the adjusted odds ratio. Actually, I'm not, yeah, and the confidence interval. And you can see there that this figure of 1.16, for those of you who weren't in the last session, you're not familiar with reading these tables, I think it's actually a risk ratio. There's an inaccuracy in that slide. The risk ratio was 1.16 for home birth, but the confidence interval you have to look at to see whether something's actually statistically significant. And you can see there that all the confidence intervals are crossing 1. So although it looks like you've got a slightly lower than 1 risk for the midwifery units in both cases, when you have something that's close to 1 like this, it's generally not significant. So we say there's no difference in the adverse outcomes. Okay, when you break this down by first-time births and subsequent births, you can see that there's a difference. not with the midwifery units, but with the home birth. And it's the nulliparous women who account for some increased risk with home births. So again, most of the differences are not actually significant, so we say there's no difference. There is some suggestion of a significant difference, although the confidence interval still comes close to 1 for home birth. And I'll go on to talk about some of our findings from the case studies that might have helped to explain that finding. Particularly if you think that, if I just point here, the freestanding midwifery unit shows no significant difference even for first-time mothers, yeah? The confidence interval is crossing 1, the risk ratio is just under 1, and here for home birth, it's over 1, and the confidence interval is slightly on the above one side, suggesting there is a significant increase in risk. And yet for the freestanding midwifery units, there's not. And this was very interesting because the freestanding midwifery units are actually on average further away, and the travel time for transfer is longer than for home birth in England. So this is not about distance, and it's not necessarily about transfer. It's not about transfer time, at least. It's something to do with the organisation of care. Because the women who are giving birth in the freestanding midwife units, these ones here, these units are very small. They usually have 1 or 2 midwives in attendance, so the rate of midwifery staff is no different from home either. The distance is usually higher because they tend to be rural. The transfer time, we know from our further analysis, is also slightly higher. So there's something else that's accounting for that difference that we have some hypotheses about, but we don't fully understand. Okay, so mode of birth, and here you see very highly significant differences, and you see it right across. So if you just look at spontaneous vertex birth, so this is vaginal birth, it's a broader definition of vaginal birth, and we'll come on to normal birth in a moment. You can see here all the confidence intervals are way over 1, and the risk ratio is way above. And then when we get for forceps delivery, it's way below, and the confidence intervals are also way below. And likewise for intrapartum caesarean section, yeah? And you can see that the difference, the significance of the difference, comes up highest with home birth. And that's followed, usually quite closely, by the freestanding midwifery unit. The hospital-based midwifery units, what we call the alongside midwifery unit, still are highly significantly reducing interventions, but you can see there's quite a jump between the hospital-based midwifery unit and the freestanding one. So you're seeing greater differences there. Oh, what happened there? Ah, right, okay. Now this is actually not my slide. I borrowed this slide from Jose Belezan, who gave a very good overview of evidence on caesarean section. And I just decided this morning to add it into my presentation because some people might say, why do intervention rates matter? Why does caesarean matter? And it's just a reminder of some of the points that, again, Kenneth and Betty made this morning. When we think about safety, there is this tendency of some commentators to set the safety of the baby against the safety of the mother, and that's been discussed in the legal session as well. But caesarean birth has significant consequences for the health of the mother and the baby, and I thought Jose's summary of that was very, very useful. You can also obtain this summary in the nice caesarean section guideline, because those guidelines are evidence-based. Oops, sorry, got the wrong thing there. So you can see, if you have a caesarean, you have an increased risk of maternal mortality. This is from a meta-analysis of all the research. Increased risk of fetal death in future pregnancies, not something we tend to think about. We tend to think about the current pregnancy. Placenta previa, uterine rupture, respiratory morbidity, hysterectomy with obvious consequences for future childbearing, uterine tract injury, vesical injury, and then where caesarean section comes up better is of course in urinary incontinence and perineal pain, but you have a much higher rate of abdominal pain. So there are serious reasons to want to avoid unnecessary caesarean sections and long-term health consequences. Okay. Normal birth, we looked at the Consensus Working Party measure of normal birth as well. This is a more positive measure. So this is a vaginal birth, but also without additional interventions in labour. And again, you see the same pattern of differences, very highly significant differences, and they're in a slope, with home birth being the greatest difference and the alongside midwifery unit still highly significant, but less so than the out-of-hospital births. So that's just a summary, really, of those findings. I'm going to run over the cost-effective analysis and not give the detail, just to say that the cost-effectiveness analysis, which was a very, very detailed study, I'm not doing justice to it here, found that for low-risk women, the cost to the NHS was lowest in a home birth, and then followed by a freestanding midwifery unit, then an alongside midwifery unit, with the obstetric unit being the most expensive. That's the costing. When we do the cost-effectiveness analysis, the cost-effectiveness comes up highest for the freestanding midwifery unit. So even though they cost a little bit more than the home birth, they do have superior outcomes. They have more optimal outcomes. Oh, hang on, I think I've missed an important slide. One of the reasons why they have optimal outcomes. Sorry, I ran across this because I couldn't see it properly. The maternal morbidity is also important, and what we see here is differences for all the midwifery-led settings. Some of these differences are pretty much what you'd expect. Lower episiotomy rates, but no increase in serious tears. Lower rate of epidural, which is not unexpected, of course. But less expected with these differences, again for the freestanding midwifery units, a lower rate of blood transfusion. So this is the really serious PPH level, is significantly lower. And the rate of women's admission to high-level care, again, highly significantly lower. So there's something that these units are doing which is very, very safe for the mother as well as the baby. And also increased rates of breastfeeding in the midwifery-led settings. Okay, so I'm just going to come on quickly to I'm going to skip the design and methods. You can get them. You can get the detailed report on the internet. But these were ethnographic case studies that we used to try to get some understanding of what might underlie the outcomes from the clinical and the economic studies. So I've just really given a very quick summary of some of the key things that came up. We were trying to focus on what makes the care safe, and we were looking on a systems level. And just a few points to highlight out of a very complex study. We found that the integration of these different birth options was really quite important. If your midwifery unit and your home birth are well embedded in the overall service, then you are likely to see better results. And of course this would probably help to account for the good outcomes of midwifery units in a country that has an integrated care system like the NHS, rather than a highly privatised system. So lots of positive things there, but we did actually find that although our system is officially integrated, we have a National Health Service, and we have the policy to back these options up, actually the practice was more variable. Oh, I keep using the wrong thing here. So we found that the actual level of support for out-of-hospital births and the level of backup for the midwives in terms of training, deployment of staff and so on was actually quite variable across the country. And we've been doing some further analysis to try to look at that, although the data are quite limited. A particular issue that came up was that community midwifery staffing was very, very variable. The ways in which home birth provision was arranged was highly variable across the country. And in some of our case studies, we found the unintended home birth rate was actually higher than the planned home birth rate. So they weren't really, officially we provide for home births, but in practice some areas were not doing this. Community midwifery was traditionally very strong in the UK, but it has been cut down in terms of the priority given to it and the numbers of midwives. So we were having reports from both the women and the midwives and the managers of shortage of staffing, midwives having to cover vast areas of the country, and in some areas where the home birth rate was lower than average, if you bear in mind the average is 3%, we have some areas with 10% and some with 0.5%. So in areas where it was particularly low, the community midwives had actually not had a lot of experience of home birth for a long time. And so those areas need to attend to their arrangements, their organisation, and the support, the numbers and the training for midwives providing home birth care. Leadership was very important, and we saw the best functioning services where the midwives and the obstetricians at a high level were supporting each other, and we saw them modelling respectful care and team working. Positive organisational culture also featured commitment to learning from problems and mistakes rather than blaming people and scapegoating. And guidelines were used very effectively. We're very lucky we have good evidence-based guidelines. Where they were used effectively to support professional decision making, we also saw high-performing services. Key challenges, just coming to the conclusions, in terms of improving the quality of birth in different settings. The major challenge, I think, for us is refocusing on community midwifery, rebuilding and maintaining the community midwives' intrapartum skills, making sure we have sufficient staffing for freestanding units. Some of these units were being closed at night because there weren't enough midwives allocated, and some had midwives visiting rather than core staff. More attention, we found, was given to training the midwives working in these units, the midwives working either to provide home birth or in the alongside units, and we don't know, but it's possible that might be linked to the different outcomes. And we also found that where you have the hospital birth centre, there were problems with boundary management, which had an impact on relationships between staff and the deployment of staff. And this possibly, again it's hypothetical, we don't know, might be accounting partly for the less optimal outcomes. It's very safe. These alongside midwifery units are showing that they're very safe, but they're not achieving the same reduction of interventions as the freestanding units are achieving. Although I have to say they also had a wider mix of women, because they were more likely to take in women who hadn't specifically opted for an alternative. So it could be partly linked to the professionals and partly the women and partly the location. And then a whiz across transfer, because I have about half a minute?
Well, there was only 20 minutes. So
Yeah,
okay.
25 minutes. Okay. I'm not going to go to conclusions, I'm just going to tell you about the policy impact so far in Britain. What we have now is the NICE intrapartum guidelines were updated this year. The consultation period was earlier in the year. The new guidelines have shifted from recommending choice to actually positively recommending women should use midwifery units and that multiparous women should use home, based on the evidence. We now have, just in the last few weeks, the NHS 5-year forward plan, which specifically recommends more development and use of midwifery units. Okay.
Thank you. Questions at the end? Okay. Thanks, Christine. Just press on the first slide.
Click on the slideshow.
Slide.
Maybe not.
Thank you. I'm Judy Slome Cohain. I live in Israel very different situation, very similar to here, a little bit better. I'm a home birth midwife. So this, and I'm also very academic. I have 77 couples. Oh, my goodness. I'm going to start again. This is on. Hi, I'm Judy Slome Cohain. I'm a home birth midwife who's done 600 private births without a single C-section or vacuum birth in Israel. And I'm academically inclined. I have 77 first author publications in midwifery and medical journals. Oh, it's doing it by itself. Thank you. I have a different perspective, but I think it's very important. All the research that's been discussed by Kenneth and also Christine is asking the question, what is it looking at perinatal mortality? And the question, it might not even be valid. The question, as a home birth midwife, I meet people all the time, and the first thing 99% of people say to me is, oh, home birth is wonderful. But what if something happens that you need an emergency C-section? And I always follow that by, what is that something? What can happen at a home birth? And everybody says, I don't know. So I set out 10 years ago to answer that question. Actually, a lot of the people say they do know, and that it's the cord around the neck, which of course happens at 1/3 of home births and hospital births and is irrelevant. But having worked in hospital, I know that in hospital they say, at least in Israel, we saved your baby's life. The cord was around the neck, and that's where people get that impression. But generally you could justify that perhaps people think that in hospital there's more equipment, and that's why it's safer. And here. And this is the equipment, more or less, that I've done 600 births, some scissors to cut the cord, a fetoscope, check the baby's heartbeat, keep the baby warm with a hat, weight, that's the scale I use. Let's see, over here. And it's not the equipment. It's the education I got. I learned in America at the University of Minnesota. My education was stupendous, and I still credit my outcomes on what I learned in school. How can I stop it from going by itself? And the proof of that is when you look at published perimortality rates, and I'm quoting on top, no, sorry. This is Janssen. Janssen found midwives in Canada to have about 0.35 up to 0.5%. That's 1 in 200,000 babies dying. And hospital, generally low-risk births, you can expect 1 in 1,000. Generally, could be a little bit less. And then on the farm, Ina May Gaskin published 4 per 1,000. In her 30 years on the farm, they published 8 perinatal deaths among 2,000 births. And 2 years ago, they collected in Oregon, and they found 5 per 1,000 among the lay midwives. So clearly, the problem with home birth has everything to do with education, how well the midwife is prepared to do a home birth, and if they're unprepared, yes, sadly, you can get perinatal mortality that could have been prevented if the woman had been delivered in hospital. A side question that I want you to think about, there is no research on unattended home births. And as somebody who's been reading research for 20 years, I want to guess, well, I wonder what the perinatal mortality rate would be for women, if 1,000 women, 1,000 low-risk women who were 37 weeks or more, and the head was down, gave birth at home, alone, with their husband, with a friend, what would be the perinatal mortality rate? And I think it would be the same as for the lay midwives, about 5 per 1,000. It certainly would be no more than 10 per 1,000. But say it's 5 per 1,000, you have to get the concept that all those meta-analyses and all that home birth research and all those numbers are saying one thing, one very simple thing, that the difference between hospital, 1 per 1,000, and no attended, just giving birth alone by yourself, is probably no more than 2 or 3 per 1,000 in the first week. So all this whole conference, all we're talking about is 2 or 3 babies dying per 1,000, and no mothers, because women will not die at home birth. Women die from cesareans now, and I'll get to this in a second, but it's good to keep an eye on it. Going back to the question, what is this thing that we need to be in the hospital because what if something happens? So everybody's sure. And does anyone know? Does anyone know when is hospital birth safer for low-risk women? Anybody? There's actually only one situation. And this is what it came down to after all my years. And you won't believe it, but this is the truth. I've read everything. The only time you will have a better outcome in hospital than you would have had at home birth is if there's cord prolapse. And here the cord prolapse, if you don't know, it's when the water is broken, the head comes down and squeezes the cord so the baby stops getting oxygen. And it'll die if it doesn't get oxygen for 8 minutes. So I think a valid question is, well, why am I a home birth midwife? If there's this situation where the woman would be safer in hospital, then she should be in hospital. So my justification is that I don't ever break the water, and I don't do vaginal exams. Now, throughout this talk, when I say never, it doesn't mean never. There is no never in obstetrics. But I would estimate I do about 4 per 1,000. I've broken the water, so maybe 2 times in the 600 births. And I do vaginal exams sometimes at full dilation to make sure the woman's fully dilated, but generally not. I generally have her start pushing, and if the baby doesn't come out, then I'll check her. So, with that, 600 births, no cord prolapse, and Agnes Gerab, the doctor in Hungary who's on house arrest, did 3,500 births with the same protocol. No vaginal exams, never break the water, no cord prolapse. And to me, that means that there is a way to deliver at home without the one reason that it would be safer to be in hospital. Now there's one more thing, if you're a doctor, you know there's such a thing as amniotic fluid embolism. This is an embolism of amniotic fluid that gets stuck in the woman's lungs, and she dies because she can't breathe. Of course, if she's at home, and it'll take half an hour to get to hospital, she's going to die. This has never been documented at a home birth with a midwife there. There's only one in all the literature. It happened in Japan after the midwife left. In my research, I can't depend just on research. I have done I look for anecdotes everywhere. And one midwife finally contacted me about a year ago. There was a woman who had an amniotic fluid embolism at home before the midwife got there. In both cases, the woman died, the baby survived. So again, the question is, why do home births if it's more dangerous? If you lose one woman to an amniotic fluid embolism. I don't want that to happen to me, ever. So the answer is that I estimate that at home, the risk of amniotic fluid embolism is about 1 in a million. I might be a little wrong. It might be 1 in 500,000. It's extremely rare. In all the literature, I could only find those 1 anecdotal case and 1 published case. So if you look at the data, if all my women had gone to hospital, and if you figure on a 10% C-section rate for low-risk women, even though in the United States it's 25%, but in Israel it's 12%. So if all those women have if 10% of women have a cesarean, and 1 in 3,000 women die of cesarean, so you've got 100 times safer at home because you've only got the risk of amniotic fluid embolism, and in hospital you're going to lose about 1 in 10,000 low-risk women. And by the way, the risk of amniotic fluid embolism now in America in hospital is 1 in 15,000. And they don't know why, and they're not going to look for a reason, but it seems to be related to inductions. The risks of hospital we've gone through that do not happen at home is, so the first one I put fetal distress. I sent this to my very good friend, midwife. I've had 1 case where of a heartbeat at a home birth among 600 home births was below 100. one case, it was a first birth. I gave her a pill of codeine, just a pill with 10 milligrams of codeine. She calmed down. The heartbeat went right up in 10 minutes. She stayed home and had a nice home birth. So I don't know why 10% of babies in hospital get cesareans for fetal distress. It doesn't happen to me. It might be the hospital causing the stress. I don't know. But certain fourth-degree tears never happen at home birth unless if the midwife has good, just wait and the baby will come out. They happen in hospital births at the rate of 1%. A lot of the people having long-term incontinence. Placental abruption. This is something that does not happen at home birth. It happens in high-risk women with high blood pressure. When you give Pitocin, uterine rupture will not happen at home if you don't deliver women with a scarred uterus. Of course, hospital-acquired infections are only going to happen in hospital. Let's get rid of this. So, the advantages to home over hospital is that home seems to prevent fetal distress. Perhaps it's the monitor. Now we have a big question, shoulder dystocia. Shoulder dystocia is the worst thing that can really happen to a home birth midwife. This is it happening. The head comes out, starts turning really dark purple, and it will not come out. So again, why am I taking a risk? Well, your assumption is that it'll be better in hospital. The research does not show that. The research shows that at home birth, the person, the expert, is there. And I've got 5 minutes. In hospital, you have to call somebody. So, with an expert midwife, you're going to do better at home. A lot of home shoulder dystocia may be prevented by having the woman deliver on all fours because it gives you an extra ½ centimeter. But when it happens, you have 5 minutes, you need someone who has a plan and knows exactly what they're going to do. If you have a lay midwife who doesn't have a plan, or a doula, yes, you will get morbidity. The baby usually doesn't die. Postpartum hemorrhage. The biggest part of my job, of course, the internet, I Googled postpartum hemorrhage and it says don't pull on the cord, but that's what everyone does in hospital and at home birth too. I have developed a protocol for delivering the placenta at 4 minutes in squatting. I have 0 postpartum hemorrhages over 1,000 cc's. 0. I'm giving a talk on that tomorrow. I hope you all come. It works, it's intuitive, it's logical, I will explain it completely. You don't have to worry about postpartum hemorrhage if you get the woman into squatting at 4 minutes and the placenta comes out. Another objection by doctors is breathing problems that can be dealt with well in the hospital in the intensive care. I haven't had any. I think that possibly I prevent it by delivering in all fours and letting the head sit there, and meanwhile the fluids come out. And I had a great picture of that in a different. The fluid just for 2 minutes flows out of the lungs, even with thick meconium, and slowly you see at the end of a minute or two, the fluid is clear completely, and I don't have breathing problems. Newborn GBS, huge problem nowadays, used to get people not to have home births. I could speak about it for 2 hours. I've published a lot of research on it. In 1 minute, who gets sick? People that are stressed, people that get cold. There is beautiful research from water births in England, 5,000 water births, that they only had 1 case of newborn GBS among 5,000 births into water. Maybe that protects the baby. Again, big topic, but hospitals do not have lower rates of GBS. Is GBS a problem at home birth? It can be. You must look how the baby's breathing for 24 hours. Keep an eye on it. Okay. In addition to preventing bleeding, the other main job of the home birth midwife is resuscitating the baby. And this is probably the thing that is most important in changing the perinatal mortality rate, that 2 per thousand. Am I actually saving any babies? Maybe I am. Newborn resuscitation almost doesn't appear on Google. It's the only thing that is not on YouTube. There is not a single newborn resuscitation on YouTube, not a real one. And that's because malpractice is what's, is what's leading our profession. This is the only picture of newborn resuscitation I could find. It's from a home birth in Australia, a licensed midwife. She takes the baby that's white, completely limp, not breathing, and puts it in the mother's arms, something I would never do. Now this woman's well trained. I don't know what she's thinking. Obviously, I'm going to hand the baby to a mother if it's breathing. I do resuscitation, but I start with this, making the baby feel startled, which means picking it up, making it drop fast like that in your hands, and it startles it and it goes, and then it takes its first breath, and then you're already doing well. If it doesn't breathe, you do need to do the next thing, which is give it oxygen, breathe for it until it gets it. So when is home birth safer than hospital birth? I think I've answered. There's only one what if, and that's cord prolapse. And it can be prevented by keeping your hands behind your back. It's not the equipment. It's the training. And this is a very important thing, and I thought it was very interesting that Christine found that they're training the midwives more in the freestanding midwifery units, and they have better outcomes. The training is what is probably gonna make the difference between the 1 in 1,000, 1 in 2,000, and the 4 per thousand. If I have more time, or anytime you want to meet with me, I can tell you what those babies died of. Yes, the farm includes some high-risk women. Yes, Oregon had undiagnosed twins. I've also delivered a few twins. I've also delivered a few breech babies. It doesn't mean the baby's going to die, but it can if you don't have the training or motivation. So in summary, home birth, I think you get it, has better outcomes than hospital if you've got a well-trained midwife who's very motivated, the head is down, and the baby's full term. So I just wanted to end with, okay, I don't know about what your availability of midwives is in Czech Republic, but if there are well-trained midwives, then this is 90% of women. 90% of women have a head-down baby at full term. So why are women still delivering in hospital? It's an interesting question. I don't have the answer for all of them. I put a quote from Einstein. It might have to do with thinking is hard work. So that's why so few people do it. I recently read, but a lot of people don't because they've heard a story. And the story is, women used to die in home birth, and now hospital saves all these women and babies. So, is this story true? This is something I researched along with everything else. No, it's not true. The oldest quote I have is from Rabbi Maimonides. In Israel, he's called the Rambam. He has a quote in his work that says, less than 1 per thousand women die in childbirth. He's referring to Jewish religious women that he worked with. He was a doctor. In 1800, if you've read Martha Ballard's diary, she has a diary of 812 births from the 1800s in rural Maine, and no women died in childbirth. 5 women died in the first month from infections. They didn't have antibiotics. People died of infections. Margaret, too, from England, did wonderful work looking at the statistics. She was a statistician, not a midwife, who looked at all the statistics of hospital births and home birth during the transition in the 1940s and 50s when birth transitioned into hospital. She could find no advantage to hospital birth, there was no improvement during those years as it transitioned in. She tried to publish her work. She had to publish it. She had to, back then, in 1970, she had to self-publish. And she's a statistician. So, wait, was there one more? Again, Dr. Agnes Garab in Hungary, who's on house arrest, and in Hungary did 3,500 home births. No women died. One baby died. She had one GBS death in the first week among 3,500 births. So when you have an excellent practitioner, she's a doctor and a midwife, very motivated. And when I say that it hasn't improved, so here Rambam wrote less than 1 in 1,000, and today it's about less than 1 in 1,000, and 1 in 5,000 is the average maternal mortality rate in developed countries like Canada and the United States. I just want to throw in that I read the Nobel Prize winner's book, Daniel Kahneman, about how people make decisions. And he defined a new term called delusional optimism. And delusional optimism we all suffer from, which is the disease that I'm not going to die of a cesarean, someone else will. Or I'm not going to be paralyzed by the epidural. The optimism that even though we know the statistics, we believe that it won't affect us. So in short, baby at term, head down, qualified midwife, you probably can, and no vaginal checks, you probably can save about maybe 1 in 1,000 babies over the outcome that these women would have in hospital when you're considering perinatal the outcome of the baby. Of course, you'll get, in the hospital, you get more mothers dying. And that's the end of the talk. Okay, the next speaker, we'll just hear from Dr. Rick for 20 minutes. Terrible time, let's see how I did. No, I didn't overdo mine. And then we'll take questions? Okay. Dr. He's from Brazil. He's famous for humanizing birth.
I need a tech guy here.
So maybe I will answer your question.
Well, yes, because it referred to your last slide. The other thing that you hadn't written up, presumably, is that it should be no identified risk factors as well. You know, for example, the woman who develops high blood pressure at 28 weeks. So that's taken as read, that they are otherwise low risk.
Right.
Okay.
We should just added that in addition to being 37 weeks or more, 37 plus 0 weeks or more, head down, the mother has to be healthy. It's of course the most important thing. Better a little bit premature and the mother doesn't have high blood pressure. Of course, healthy is almost completely dependent on her diet. You can take just about any, because if she got pregnant, she's pretty healthy. If you work on her with diet and she listens to you, you can solve any problem that I've ever had to deal with. Still going. One more question? I have more things to say. Yeah? No? I'm waiting for him. So the issue in the last talk came up of lawsuits. I can't be sued because I don't own a house or a car. And no lawyer will take a case against me because there's no assets to obtain. I live in a house that's owned by my husband. I'm the second wife, so by law, it doesn't belong to me. And I don't own a car. And you can easily put anything in your children's names. That's a solution to that. And that's the end of the question of needing insurance. I don't need insurance, you can't sue me. You can put me in jail, but you can't sue me.
Thank you very much. My name is Ricardo Jones, I come from Brazil. Can you hear me? Am I speaking slowly? Okay, so you'll understand. So I'm an MD. MD means medical doctor or midwife in disguise. So, in fact, I'm sort of a aberration here, since I'm a man and a doctor in a midwifery conference talking about home birth. I'm not going to talk to you. I'm not going to show you any numbers because I'm not from the university. I'm just a plain doctor. I work in my city. It's in the extreme south of Brazil. It's a city called Porto Alegre, that means happy harbor. And so all I'm trying to show you is what is happening in Brazil right now. And I hope that Brazil can be an example for the rest of the world to the way that we are trying to change birth in Brazil. Well, this is my country. This is a very, very big country compared to any European country that you can just cross from one country to the other with 1 hour flight. To cross Brazil, we need 10 hours flight sometimes. And in 2012, we were 190 million people, and now we reach almost 200 million people. Urban population is 85%, and the rural population 14%. So Brazil is a country like other countries in South America. And we need to talk about this woman. This is the president of Brazil. And now Brazil, for the second time, we have a woman as a president. Her name is Dilma Rousseff. She just got elections last week. And so Brazil is still debating the election because Dilma Rousseff won the election 52 to 48. So it was a very tight election, like Obama in the United States, like Hollande in France. So she is left-wing. This is going to be 16 years of left-wing government in Brazil. But this woman is doing a very good job about birth because she created the Stork network, Rede Cegonha, as you can see. This is Rede Cegonha, Stork network, and is a system in Brazil trying to put Brazil out of the cesarean statistics. Because, as you know, Brazil is the champion of the world in cesarean sections. Okay, we used to be the champions of the world in football, but you know, we have a very, very bad experience with the Germans in the next competition. So we are very sorry about that. But you know, we're still the champions in cesarean sections. But this competition, we are trying to lose. And we are doing our best to lose this kind of competition. And this is the ethnicity in Brazil, just to show you that the mixed and the blacks are majority in Brazil nowadays. So, a guy like me, with the English background, that's why my name is Jones, we are a minority in Brazil now. And so Brazil is a melting pot of races. And this is our best thing. This is our most important characteristic. We are a mixed country with Indians, blacks, Europeans, and Europeans. So this is very important to understand Brazil. This is Brazil. As you see, Brazil has a lot of poverty, even though in the last years we went out of the hunger map of the world because of this government that we have nowadays. So the distribution of wealth in the country is becoming very better. And this is Brazil as well. So we have great cities. São Paulo is a city that more than 10 million people is. We have this rivalry with Mexico City as the biggest city in the world, and Shanghai in China. But this is Brazil. So we are part of the BRICS. So Brazil and Russia and India and South Africa, so are the leaders of this bloc that are developing rapidly. So this is something to understand cesarean section in Brazil. We have 40 billion year healthcare budget. Try to compare that with the United States that has that has something like $3 trillion healthcare budget, and we have 40 billion healthcare budget. So it's only $317 per person per year. So every person in the country has only $300 a year as the healthcare budget, and only 6.8% of the gross product. So it's not that much. Compare that to the United States, that has 16% of the gross product. And doctors' average annual income is $40,000 a year. So a little bit more than $3,000 a month. Well, to understand how people are treated by the healthcare in Brazil, we need to understand that we have this specific system. We have the SUS. This is the Unified System of Healthcare. It's the biggest system in the world because in Brazil, every citizen is covered by SUS. Every single one. You don't need to pay anything, you don't need to be employed, you just need to be born in Brazil. So you are covered by this universal system. So if I break my leg in Brazil, I go to a public hospital and somebody will fix my leg. If I need a heart transplant in Brazil, the government will pay whatever you want, whatever is needed to do a heart transplant. My mother needed a bypass, a heart bypass, so she did it by the unified system. So everyone in the country has this system. This system has 38% cesarean section rate. This is the public system that everyone has. It's paid by the government. But that aside, we have two other systems. We have the private insurance, private health companies that you pay to have a better care. And better care means luxury, means a beautiful hospital, means that you don't go into a line to be assisted. This is what some people pay, middle class people pay. And you have for sure private, out of the pocket to doctors and hospitals that you pay for doctors to have assistance. And these two combined, they have 85% cesarean section rate. And this part of the country means 55 million people. 55 million people from the middle class have this kind of assistance. That means that if you go to a mall to have some coffee with your friends, and that happened to me every time, and sometimes I see a woman in the mall with a child, I can ask her, where was your cesarean section done? And she will say, oh, Moinhos Mental Hospital. But doctor, how do you know I had a cesarean section? Well, you're in the mall. It's like a church of consumerism. So you're in the mall, so you're in the middle class. I can see the keys of your car in your pocket. So you are from the middle class. So I know that 4 out of 5 women from the middle class in Brazil have a cesarean section. And sometimes I make a mistake, and the woman said, but doctor, I had a vaginal birth. Don't you remember you were my doctor? Oh, sorry. That's the only way to make this kind of mistake. Well, this is the problem. Middle class in Brazil has 85% chance to have a cesarean section. This is the model of care we have in Brazil. Doctors are the supreme gods in obstetric wards. We don't have enough midwives in Brazil. And that's one of the most important problems. We don't have midwives. We slaughtered midwifery in Brazil. We killed all the midwives, metaphorically speaking. Because we didn't have courses for midwifery. We closed the midwifery course in 1970 and now reopened in 2004. So we are beginning to create, thanks to the Stork network, we are beginning to create in the University of São Paulo the direct entry midwifery programs like we had before. We don't have enough nurse midwives. Midwives that do post-graduation in, nurses that have post-graduation in midwifery. So don't have enough midwives to assist birth. And this is the kind of care we have in Brazil. Doctors are the more important, women are alone, technology is the best, and there is no privacy, no intimacy, and that's something that we see in normal hospitals in Brazil. This is area map of Brazil. Look, this is Amazon over there, 38%, because a lot of lay midwives assist birth there. This is São Paulo in the middle, 60% cesarean section rate overall, mixing public hospitals and private hospitals. We have Minas Gerais, MG, 57%, and this is my state, 62% cesarean section rate overall. So it is uncommon to have vaginal birth in my state. The most normal thing for a woman that is pregnant is to have a cesarean section. If she's from the middle class, it's almost 90. But if you are a normal woman, you have 60% chance, 62% chance to have a major surgery to have a baby. So that's the problem. And why that? Because we don't have a midwifery system in our country to deal with birth. Doctors control birth. Doctors control hospitals. And they see home birth and birth centers as obstetric violence. They consider home birth and they consider birth centers as obstetric violence because there is no doctor and because there is no emergency available to do cesarean section. So our cesarean sections in the 70s were 13% and now they are 56%. The whole country is 56% cesarean sections. My city, Porto Alegre, in 2010 we had 51.9 cesarean section rate in the city. And if you think this is amazing, if you think this is terrible, well, that's what I think. The other problem that we have in Brazil is obstetric violence. This is something that we are discussing a lot nowadays. 1 out of 4 women in hospitals complain of obstetric violence. And obstetric violence means shouting at women, avoiding the presence of a companion, like a husband or a friend, not giving pain medications when they want to, mocking the woman and humiliating the woman all the time, saying, "Oh, when you did your baby, you didn't scream like that. Now you came to the hospital screaming." This is common in Brazil. "Oh, you're not allowed to scream here. Oh, this is not your house. You're going to wake up the other patients in the hospital," and blah, 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 blah. So this is very common in our country. So 1 out of 4 women complain from obstetric violence. So we are now reaching the flipping point. In Brazil, when you are pregnant, it's like to throw a coin. And how to say it in English? Is crown or face? So
Heads or tails.
heads or tails. That's it. Yes. So in Brazil we say cara ou coroa. Means the crown or the face. Okay. So it's like that. We just throw a coin, and that's the decision to have a cesarean section or not. More than 50% of women have a cesarean section. So the World Health Organization is saying there is no justification for any place in the world to have a cesarean section rate higher than 10 to 15%. So why is there a gap between evidence-based medicine and current obstetrical practice? So why do we know that we are doing wrong and why we keep doing it? And the answer is probably power. The power is in the wrong hands. So my question is, what to do? Well, one of the things that we did in Brazil, do I have time? No. 7 minutes. One of the things that we did in Brazil, I was going to show you a lot of people that I like. But one of the things that we do, yes, a lot of things that we do in Brazil is in my city, to work as a team. And a team composed of an obstetrician, me, a midwife, and a doula. So we created a team. If you want to know that, you can buy Robbie Davis Floyd's book called Birth Model Does That Work. There is a chapter called Team Approach, and I wrote a chapter about the experience that we have in Brazil. And in this approach, we begin to work with home birth and hospital birth because we put the decision in the woman's hands. So they decide if they want to stay at home or whether they want to go to the hospital. In this, I'm going to show you a movie of the birth assistant in Brazil. It's called Agua, and Agua means water because we use a lot of water in birth at home. And one of the things that I want you to know is, first, this is beautiful Brazilian music. You will love it. I'll show you. And the second is, in the middle of the movie, there's a woman that says, "Eu não acredito, eu consegui." That in Portuguese means, "I can't believe, I got it." It was a story of a woman that had an obstetric violence in hospital, and she had a cesarean section. And so she decided to have a home birth. And when she got the baby in her hands, she began to cry and say, "I can't believe I got it. I did it. It's impossible, but I did it." Everybody said that it was impossible to have a baby after cesarean section, but I decided to stay at home and I had my baby. So it's a really moving moment for this woman, and I hope for you too. I know you like the kissing. Well, I just want to finish. I would like to show you another short clip about what happened 2 years ago in Brazil. Sorry. 2 years ago in Brazil, in national television, a colleague of mine called Jorge Kuhn is a doctor and an obstetrician, one of the best of the country, that was working in São Paulo. He's still working in São Paulo. He said on national television that there is no problem in home birth. And because if the woman is okay, she's not hypertension, and she doesn't have hypertension, she doesn't have diabetes, the baby is okay, the baby is vertex, it's not a breech baby, blah, 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 blah. It's okay to have a vaginal birth at home. And then this guy was sued by the medical board. The medical board made a complaint and tried to get his license off. The medical board tried to sue him, and immediately the activists in Brazil, the activists of Brazil decided to make a major national movement to protest for the first time in this country against what happened with our colleague Dr. Jorge Kuhn. And so in 31 cities all over the country, and one city outside Brazil, in Italy, we made a march that is called the March for Home Birth in Brazil. More than 5,000 people went to the streets to protest against this action and to reinforce choices for women. And so for the first time, women in Brazil organized to do a march. And that is my answer. When people were asking me outside, what is the answer to obstetric violence, and what is, how are we going to fix the system that is broken in Brazil about childbirth? And what can we do? I think that, as Michael Klein once said to me, the doctor from Canada, he said to me, Ricardo, we are just doctors. We are not to make any revolution. And midwives cannot do any revolution because they're just a few. Doulas, they cannot do any revolution. Only women can do this revolution. Women are the only ones that can lead a revolution to bring back birth to its natural state. Only women organized in every city, every community, every small town, and in the government can push the agenda to make things happen in the country. So I'm going to show you rapidly the march for home birth in Brazil and what happened. Begins with the doctor, it's in Portuguese, sorry. It begins with Dr. Jorge Kuhn saying in television that there is no problem to have a home birth if the woman is not ill. And then what happens next, and then the march.
And it's only 5 more minutes.
Yes, it's just 5 minutes. June 2012. Fantastic is the name of the program. The specialist invited to the program is Dr. Jorge Kuhn.
Departamento de Obstetrícia da Universidade Federal de São Paulo.
He's from the University of São Paulo.
Mas avisa, ele só pode ser feito quando a
Birth can only happen if the woman has no disease.
Nenhuma intercorrência que é clínica, que é obstétrica, portanto, pressão alta, diabetes,
no diabetes, no hypertension,
qualquer
so she can have a baby at home.
Risco para essa mãe e para esse bebê.
Some hours after that, the medical board from Rio de Janeiro put in the press a note to sue Dr. Jorge Kuhn. This is Cremerge, is the medical board who will denounce a medical that defends the home birth. Immediately, the activists in the humanization of childbirth in Brazil wrote a letter to the population, and many manifestations happened all over the country. In the days 16 and 17 of June 2012, thousands of people in 31 cities in Brazil and one outside Brazil went to something that it was called March for Home Birth. This is my saying. This is an old me. The next week, the same program, it always happens on Sundays, was showing what happened in Brazil after the march. More than 5,000 women went to the streets to protest and to say that they decide, this is my body, that is my decision. This is São Paulo.
A mobilização começou na internet, pelas redes sociais, tudo motivado pela reprodução de uma reportagem que o Fantástico exibiu no domingo passado.
So thank you very much for your attention. This is what we're doing in Brazil, and even though we have this system that is broken, we are trying to do our best as activists to protest and to make birth much better for women and babies. Thank you.
It's time for questions. I'm going to make one comment first, which is that I enjoyed that point, the point in Brazil, when things, and Phil Hall, the great obstetrician, told me a long time ago, when I felt depressed, that he said, don't worry, when things go too far to any extreme, they'll always come back. And in Brazil, you have an extreme, but it's very unimpressive to me that 5,000 women out of millions and millions. I mean, when you go to the extreme of 85% cesarean, it should be 85 million women. So you're not quite there. But I'm more extreme. I want to make the point that in the movie, of the first movie he just showed, every single one of those births, I would say there were 5 births, if nobody had attended those births, the baby just came out by itself. And you women need to realize how little they need help. And actually, to me, there was no reason for any midwife or doctor to be grabbing those babies. Those babies were coming right out. And if I was the midwife, I would have let the baby come out. I wouldn't have touched it. And that's a big point. On the other hand, talking about extremes, this water birth, I went to the water birth conference talk. I'm going which way? This water birth, I mean, you love the movie. This is shoulder dystocia. If this woman is in the pool, whatever time it takes you to get her out of that water pool, those big pools, this baby's not getting oxygen, not what he should be. We don't know. Until he's out, you don't know what kind of resuscitation you're dealing with. And we're also going to extremes with, we all have to be born in a warm pool of water, and it's so wonderful. Just know there's an extreme on both sides. This baby might suffer. If it was in the pool, as a midwife, this has happened. And then you're going to lose as much time as it takes to get that woman out of the pool, because you're not going to be able to deal with a real shoulder dystocia in a deep pool of water. So I'm not anti-doctor, I'm not anti-anything. There are extremes, and you have to know and be educated. And you also have to know that your risk of having an unattended home birth, which I never ever would recommend, is about 1 in 1,000, and you'll never die if you have ambulance service. So it's very interesting to really empower yourself to say, hey, my body works. And it's funny how the movies all focus on the birth. The real work, my real work, is all the prenatal care of making a woman have good enough nutrition so that she has excellent blood pressure and checking that the head is down. So any questions?
Yeah, could I just make a quick point on your comment there? I've been facilitating water birth for about nearly 20 years now. Yeah.
50% of my births are in water.
Yeah.
But not in pools. Because I can let the water out of a bathtub. I can't let the water out of a big pool.
No, I think your point is very good. We shouldn't be working to extremes. But I have to say that if there is the potential, there is always a potential of shoulder dystocia, whatever kind of birth the woman has. But if you've got the right facilities with the pool, you can empty the pool very, very quickly. So that's one thing. And if that woman there is laid flat on her back and it looks like a fetal in lithotomy.
Oh yeah, that's a...
Yeah, so I think that's one extreme.
I just Googled it, that's,
you know. It's just making a point that a woman's position is very, very important in terms of giving birth. And I think water birth, we have to be careful that we're not scaring practitioners too, because I've only probably, in all the water births I've seen, seen very few issues with the fact that the woman is in water, because she's usually stood up and her pelvic outlet is very wide. So it's in my practice, it's very rare for a woman to have shoulder dystocia in those positions.
Of course it's very rare.
That's
the
just
998 times she doesn't even need you there.
No. And so
that's why when I'm there, I want to make a difference. But I don't know what kind of pool you're referring to.
Various pools.
That you can let water out.
Yeah, you can. Well, there's a plug, so you just let it out.
And where's the water go? All over the floor?
No. They're not. It's not necessarily at home. But I'm talking about pools in hospitals, in maternity units. I mean, I obviously work in England, so we have water pools available for women in most maternity units, and they have plugs. But So it's kind of like...
I'm very pro water birth, and 50% of my births are in water. In bathtubs like that, where you can let the water out.
She could still stand up though, couldn't she, and get on.
She can do anything she wants, but none of those pools look like that you could let the water out. Yes?
Yeah, I have a lot of, I attend a lot of birds and water birds as well, and the mothers I attend, they use pools at home, and no plug.
And no plug.
No, if it's at home, it's
natural.
Can I just say, I've had one shoulder exposure in a pool similar to that at home, and it's amazing how you can get the woman out if you need to.
Yes.
Oh,
You know,
That's my experience.
It's surprising.
It's really easy to
You
get
have
out.
to get them out. The husband's there, you're there, you get them out, and you deal with it. It's surprising. You always think about at home in the dark of the night what would happen if this, but when it happens, you can do
But
it.
also underwater, you can feel perfectly what the baby is doing and then what he comes to and help him just a little part that is needed, and not baby comes out.
Just the act of
And
getting
underwater, you
out.
have very good results with recovering the baby.
I'm talking about the rare event when.
Yes.
So, but it doesn't is the reason to say that they can't give birth in pool, because that's the only option at home.
I'm just recommending a pool with a plug. That's all. Yeah. Yeah.
I think it's very important not to get into extremes. And, you know, I'm a supporter of Homebirth. I've done research in Homebirth. I teach midwives to do Homebirth. I've done Homebirth myself, but you know, if you do enough Homebirth, I think you can love it. You know, I don't think that you can say that having 600 Homebirth, you won't have any third or fourth degree kids. At one time you will.
Yeah, you will.
And actually, you know, my very first Homebirth was, I had been a midwife for 14 days. In Denmark, you have to attend Homebirth, as all midwives do. And my very first was a shoulder dystocia, and it didn't come easy. You know, I had her on all four, I had her standing, I had her lying. You get it, yeah? And I really felt when I came home from that, okay, you know, I was happy I could do it, but it could have gone otherwise. And I think there's something to learn from this, that I think that Christine had a very good point about, it's about education, it's about backup, it's about who you are, it's about relationships. There are all things of kinds to learn. And you know, the good thing maybe if you are, what I would hope for Czech Republic, for instance, would be a situation where midwives could go out, two midwives, help each other out, a better system for transfer and things like that. And I just wanted to say this, to look for solutions, not just to be brave, you know, make a good organization. So that's what I just wanted to say.
I just want to change the conversation a little. I have a question for Christine, and it's about the interest we have in North America about the birth center study in Britain. And what do you think, as an anthropologist and as doing a study that you presented here, what was the rationale, the reason, and what are the reasonings that have been discussed in Britain about why the Maltese have this excess, or sorry, the primates have excess problems?
I don't think there's been much discussion of the whys actually. And although we did case studies alongside the cohort study and analysed our findings before we saw the statistical outcomes, it's still hypothesis, because that kind of research doesn't test hypotheses, it helps you to form hypotheses. So we have some ideas from the case studies of what might be the factors, and I mentioned some of those: level of integration, level of training, leadership, quality of relationships between professionals, the decline of community midwifery and the low home birth rates in some parts of Britain. We did attempt to do an analysis. In the further analyses that we've been doing on the data set, we attempted to analyse, to look at high home birth rate areas compared to low, but actually, unfortunately, the data weren't good enough quality for us to be able to do a proper analysis, so we couldn't answer that question, which is a real shame. So I think we need to do more research on this, using the hypotheses that we've got to try to explore what's going on there. I don't think we can simply assume that it's necessarily the case, because the safety of birth depends on your maternity system as well as your social context.
And is there any confidential inquiries or anything going on around that?
No, we have confidential inquiries. It's not focused on one thing. There's root cause analysis of all maternal mortality and analysis of perinatal mortality. It doesn't focus on one birth setting. One of the problems we've got is that the routine data aren't good enough quality. They are in Scotland, and has a smaller population. In England, they're not good enough quality for us to be able to continue to monitor without doing this very expensive research. So, you know, a really good quality data-based retrospective study can be really valuable, but we actually don't have good enough data to do it. So.
Any more questions? Yeah.
Could I just ask you, Dr. Jones, how you're going to take things forward in Brazil? I mean, I would presume that the women who still have private care or opt for private care, their caesarean rates will still remain high. So how do you might have more success in the public sector, but how are you going to spread that more widely?
Well, the great problem in Brazil is the private sector, the insurance company and the private patients, because they have one-to-one relationship with the doctor.
Yeah.
Okay, so this doctor gets the same money if he does a cesarean section or a natural birth or a vaginal birth. So instead of spending 12, 15, 16, 20 hours in the hospital, he spends just 30 minutes. And so he tries to convince this woman, for her to make a decision that is the best for her, is to schedule a cesarean section. It has to do with power, the power that the doctors have in our community, the power that doctors have in our country. So when the doctor says something, you believe, because he's a doctor, he's studied for that. He is like the judge. You don't mistrust the judge. You say, no, he's a judge, he made a good decision. He's a doctor, he made a good decision. But now, the National Association for Agência Nacional de Saúde Suplementars Health is the part of the government that deals with the private sector and the insurance companies. Is doing a lot of things because the activists, we pressure them, pressure the government to make modifications. And one of the things that is going to happen is that these hospitals that have high cesarean section rate, like in Brazil we have hospitals with 97 cesarean section rates. 97. So nurses, midwives, and doctors, they never see vaginal birth, not to say normal and spontaneous or natural birth. No, they only see birth as a surgical event. And these hospitals are going to have some kind of fees. So they have to pay more because they are not behaving the way they should behave. Doctors, you know, the rates for cesarean section from hospitals and doctors will be publicized. So you will know that these doctors only do cesarean section. Because one of the things that happen in Brazil is you come to a doctor and say, doctor, I want a vaginal birth. Would you help me? Oh, for sure, I will help you. But when she's 36, 37, he begins to do a lot of tests. And so he will do tests and ultrasounds, and eventually he will say, oh, the cord is around the neck. I'm so sorry. We'll have to do cesarean section, and I think the best day is Monday, 8 o'clock. It's an emergency cesarean section next Monday, 8 o'clock. So now we're pushing in the direction that these doctors need to prove. And every cesarean section in Brazil, I think that next year is going to be like that. We need a partogram. So you need to show that you tried birth and eventually, ultimately, you have to do cesarean section. If you don't do that, you need to explain to association from the government that you need to prove that the cesarean section was really necessary. And if the woman decides for herself that she wants a cesarean section, against all the information that you had, she needs to sign a lot of papers that is her responsibility. So, step by step, we're trying to improve.
We're very blessed that the person who published a paper in Birth about 6 or 7 years ago is McCourt, about how elective cesareans should be paid for by out of pocket. Wasn't it? I mean, isn't that one of your studies in Birth? I guess so this idea has been published, you can refer to it, and she's right here. Very impressive, because that is the answer, make women pay. Yeah.
Hello, another comment, Sheena Byron from England, just to say, Ricardo, I thought that your talk really gives inspiration to even people in England, because what it does is it gives us hope and inspiration just for the future, that change is possible. And I just felt so inspired by seeing the things that you showed, and I just hope that it helps people in other countries to try to make the change happen. And I have to agree with you, the women who are the ones who are going to hopefully make the change happen. And just to add to your marches, I would really push everyone to use social media to try to help your change to happen, because now we have it. At the touch of a button, we can share information widely, and it's free. Apart from your time that you put into doing it, we've got this huge resource now that's never been done before. In all my time as a midwife, I've never been able to rally the troops as I can now with social media. So you can connect with lawyers, with women who are using the service, with birth activists, with doctors, with midwives, to try to make the case and put it forward. So just, if you can use Twitter or Facebook, try and do that as much as you can to get people connected to make the case. So thank you, thanks Ricardo for all that, 'cause it's amazing.
Just to explain, this march was all done by Facebook.
Yeah.
We did it in the night, and we called every person we knew in every single city and said, we have a march, and it is going to happen 16 and 17 June 2012. And so every people that knew that made these banners and went to the streets with the kids and wrote in the valleys and things like that. And the other thing that you said, all I wanted when I came to this conference is to look at everyone's eyes and bring back to my country a little bit of hope that things can change. Thank you.
So, and I read research about 4 hours a day, and whenever I read anything relevant, I put it on my Facebook page. So that helps do some work for you.
Thank you. I'm Susanna Krišková from Slovakia. I have one question for Dr. Ricardo about the research that you told about obstetric violence numbers. That's one question, where it was published in English. And the second is just a comment that I don't really think that the solution for elective cesarean section is make women to pay, because women have various reasons for cesarean sections. It can be very bad vaginal experience, it can be sexual abuse in the past, it can be lots of things, and I think the solution is in support of the women, not making them suffer again in an economical way. That's also violence asking women for money to access their right.
Are you a midwife?
Yeah, I'm a birth activist, human rights. So this is just two comments.
Which I totally disagree with.
Sorry, can I just make a correction, because you mentioned a systematic review. Our systematic review actually showed that most women don't choose cesarean sections. That was the main message from our systematic review, so I don't want people to think that that systematic review suggested that women should pay. Our main conclusion was that most women do not freely choose a cesarean section.
Yeah.
Yes, I just wanted to add to what Susanna was saying, that I think the idea that making women pay, I think that's an awful idea, because women are having cesareans because, as you've been saying, they've been told that that's what they should do, that's the safe way, that's the healthy way. So what you're doing is you're then making the person who doesn't have the power in the situation already, you're then saying, hey, now you have to pay because somehow it's your fault that you're in this situation.
We're talking about when the doctor says doesn't need a cesarean, and I was talking about when the doctor says there's no need for a cesarean, and the woman says, I want one anyway. That's what I was talking about.
I understand that, but again, you've got to look at the culture, and particularly somewhere like Brazil, if you've got a culture where people are being told that's the safe, easy way to do it, then that's a massive ask to then say to women, but you don't need to do that. Women have been brought up in that culture, believing that's the safe thing to do. So the women aren't going to be the ones that are going to make the changes. The system's going to have to make the changes to support the women. Okay.
Well, to answer the question, it was this statistics about 25% violence was done by an independent group in Brazil called Abramo Institute from the Fiocruz is an institute. If you talk to me later, I can try to figure out how to find that in English. Okay. And the other thing is about making women pay for cesarean sections when they want cesarean sections. First, in Brazil, the research was done, and 30% of women decided to have a cesarean section during prenatal care. 30%. And 70% they decided to have a vaginal birth. But these women, 90% had cesarean sections in the private sector, 90%, even though only 30%. And 30% is different from England, for instance, where women can face what's going to happen in the future and say, well, I can have a good birth, or I can have a cesarean. But in Brazil, you have, I have a very traumatic birth or a cesarean. So the decision for cesarean sections is based in dignity. So I want something, I don't want to be treated badly in hospital. And one of the things that I learned from a birth activist and a doula in the United States, Penny Simpkin, she wrote a book called When Survivors Give Birth. And in this book she shows women that were really traumatized in her sexual life during adolescence, and they give birth. In the movie Orgasmic Birth, there's a scene that shows a woman giving birth after being abused in the adolescence and as a teenager. Then my question is, what happened in Brazil if you are abused and you are poor and you go to a hospital and you say, I don't want to have a vaginal birth because that makes me, remember what happened to me when I was a teenager? Or what happens to a woman that had a very, very traumatic birth with very incompetent birth attendants, midwives or doctors in Brazil with crystal and episiotomies like that? And then she said, no, I don't want that anymore, I want a cesarean section. So you have to pay. So this is not fair, at least in Brazil. I can imagine that maybe in England, maybe in Denmark, maybe in other countries, I don't know. But in Brazil, to make these women pay to have a cesarean section, that's awful. And this is never going to happen.
I disagree. It's not working. Any more questions?
Just one. Can you buy the film Agua?
Agua. No, it's not for sale. I can give you, but it's not for sale. The problem is that I don't have the permission for these women to... So if you want to use it for education, and because the only fear that we have in Brazil is that somebody films the presentation and puts on the internet. And this woman opens the Facebook and say, look what I said, this naked woman and giving birth like cows. That's my fear.
It's thinking about sharing with human midwives.
I just want to speak to sexual abuse. I have a very unique point of view. I have a private practice. I can spend any amount of time with my clients. I do about 4 births a month. So I've got lots and lots of time. And I'll just give, this is just my little experience. My experience is that women who say they've been abused, I'm not so sure, but the women, there's an Epino birth trainer, and the representative is here. He actually came to the talk, he just left. And it's a birth trainer to prevent tearing. And my women don't buy it, but I do it once with them, with all first births. And my experience is, when I show them the balloon, and the woman, it's a wonderful thing that every midwife should use. Why? But even if it didn't prevent tearing, it does, but the women who've been severely abused look at it and say, uh-huh, well, uh-huh. You know, they're obviously not going to do it. They don't have to even tell you. And it's a wonderful screening tool for serious, serious sexual abuse. And for you, for a woman, for any woman to say elective cesarean section is a solution for a woman who's been abused that really...
I didn't say that. I didn't say solution. I said it may be a reason.
That it should, to make it an option means that you don't want to spend enough time with her.
I didn't say that. I didn't say women need support, not just punishment with a payment. If we give her enough support, if we give enough care, enough, she may choose for a vaginal birth. It can be a beautiful, healing story for a sexual abuse. It can. But we are living in a country where we have not such support, and she may have very, very bad experience. And then she's going through a system where she's going to be abused again. I'm going to say, okay, you can be abused, or you can pay for elective cesarean. That's not a solution.
That's very sad.
We have to think in the context, not just making solutions that are.
Well, we better work hard to make her have options.
Of course.
Okay, 2 o'clock, home birth panel here. Thank you.